Format that we've got for this evening is that I will lead off with a presentation that reflects and digests the urban tract that was published a couple of months ago, Urban Mission 40 Years On. And then we have three respondents who are here with us, and I haven't written down the order that people are coming. I guess I have written down the order that people are coming in. Our first of our respondents is Israel Olofinjana, who is currently works for the Evangelical Alliance One People Commission, but has been a Baptist minister in Southeast London and many other things in terms of his academic and writing credentials. Number two is retired Bishop Laurie Green, who I've known for many years. Like me, has connections with the East End, and I believe still, like me, supports West Ham, and is in retirement for a good number of years now. He was the Bishop of Bradwell, and was for a number of years a key coordinator of the National Estates Churches Network. So it would be good to hear from Laurie as a respondent. And then our third respondent is Anna Ruddick, who I've known for a good few years and has worked as an urban mission practitioner in Manchester, and a couple of 2-3 years ago completed a PhD, which she has turned into a book, which no doubt we will refer to. So we have, I hope we have some quality speakers here. I won't say that I'm necessarily one of them, but I hope that will enable us to have a good discussion this evening. After the three respondents, we hope to go into smaller breakout groups for 10 to 15 minutes, so that we can have a proper discussion and raise some questions of the issues that we've brought to you tonight. Just to say before I start, I see all of you except me are muted, which is a good thing. It's up to you whether you keep your cameras on or not. The meeting is actually being recorded, and the main contributions will be available on our William Temple Foundation YouTube channel in due course. If you haven't seen the Urban Tract, I see in the chat that I think Tim has put up the link to get a free copy of the actual piece of literature which we're going to talk about tonight. Right, so I'm going to move into my presentation, and hopefully I will be able to share my screen with you. Is everybody okay and seeing a screen? Yeah, thumbs up if you can. Okay. Presentation tonight is based on the first of our series of urban tracts, which I wrote. I'm actually the commissioning editor for the series as well. And this tract is a reflection of Urban Mission 40 Years On. And in a sense, it's a personal reflection on my pilgrimage, career, whatever you like to call it, through those 40 years being involved in urban mission activities. And it is, because it's personal, it focuses somewhat on experience in East London and more recently in Lancashire. And it also, because of where I'm located within the church, it sort of has an evangelical flavour or bias to it. It doesn't tell the whole story of urban mission, but I hope it will be helpful to reflect on it. Hang on, I need to get to the right place. Right, slideshow. Slideshow. We start in 1981. I have some fond memories of 1981. My sporting memories are more about West Ham and Liverpool at Wembley in the League Cup final. But it's 40 years since Ian Botham did that miracle test match performance. At the same time that summer, major things were going on. In the middle of July, there was a whole week of urban riots in London, particularly in Toxteth, in Liverpool, and in many other cities across the country. Interestingly, I missed out all of those. As a single young man, I was spending my holiday that July rail roving around France, so I missed a lot of it. There was very definitely a Christian response to this wave of riots. It accumulated in the Faith in the City report, but at the same time, there was an evangelical response in the formation of ECOM, Evangelical Coalition for Urban Mission, for which I worked for a number of years as their key networker across the country. The launch meeting, in fact, of ECOM was in Birmingham and coincided with the first of the Brixton riots on, I think it was April the 11th, when the streets of Brixton erupted in what many people would call an uprising, particularly against the activity of the Metropolitan Police. Again, the excitement was happening in Brixton and I missed it because I was doing some good Christian stuff in Birmingham that day. A government response was very much focused around regeneration. And in the 1980s, I was involved in this because I was living and working in London Docklands in Canning Town. And I saw some of the developments there and indeed was partly involved in some of the campaigning to make them more humane and more in line with community wishes. The 80s, of course, was the decade when this lady was dominant, and this picture was a striking picture taken just after the 1983 general election, when one of her concerns or quotes was, "We have got to take back those inner cities." Well, regeneration was one of the ways they tried to do it, but there was also this, sorry, I'm going a little bit too fast. There was also a racial justice response in the SCARMAN report, which was a pretty fair attempt to listen to local Black communities in London. It was also a Christian response on racial justice. I was very involved in a group called Evangelical Christians for Racial Justice, which had quite a large membership, quite big conferences. We did a lot of the theological work. And by the end of the 1980s, had launched this manifesto for urban mission. Going on then into the 1990s, the 1990s was a time where personally I was more involved in raising small children than anything else and working locally in Newham. It was a time where there were many Church Urban Fund projects. It was a time when the initial moves for community organising, which became Citizens UK, took place. And it was a time where there was a growing awareness of religious diversity. I worked in Newham as a community researcher and was responsible for 3 editions of the Newham Directory of Religious Groups, which I put there. Time moves on very quickly, and by 2000, the noughties, we as a family had moved up to Preston. It was an age of New Labour, an age of lots of regeneration through sport and culture, Commonwealth Games, things like the Albert Dock in Liverpool and Tyneside, all these developments where they thought sport and culture were the key to regeneration. Many of us were involved in regeneration partnerships. When I came to Preston before long, I was involved in the SRB, Single Regeneration Budget Board for the Avon Central Regeneration Partnership. It wasn't on a grander scale as some of the bigger metropolitan cities, but it was the flavour of the time, regeneration. But the noughties was also the time when good and bad religion came to the fore. It's 20 years this month, as we remember, from 9/11. But even before there, in the summer of that year, there were disturbances in Lancashire, in the northern mill towns in Bradford, Burnley, Oldham, etc. And one of the themes that government policy was then on for about 10 or more years was on community cohesion, and the theme of particularly of Muslim and white communities leading parallel lives. The Noughties, in terms of a church response, it was 20 years since the Faith in the City report by the middle of the decade, and the Church of England pulled together another commission and produced this Faithful Cities report. There's some good stuff in that report. One of the key conclusions was that lots of the regeneration money has led to growth, but it's actually dramatized the gap between the super rich and the poorest. The concept of faithful capital was introduced in this report. But largely that report soon became forgotten and neglected. And in fact, it's very hard to find and order a copy of it these days. Interesting question there. Why did the church response fizzle out? There's a bit of a damp squib from the middle of the noughties onwards. Not that the church was silent or inactive. There was probably, particularly in the evangelical churches, a growing number of new projects. A lot of these franchise projects had their origins in that decade. Christians Against Poverty, Street Pastors, the Eden Networks with their urban mission teams, Urban Expression, the Trussell Trust. All these groups were beginning to be active and to spread across different cities around the country. And then we come to 2010, 2020, the age of austerity and the age of Brexit. And there was a real sense that deprivation was moving away from some of the inner cities that had been regenerated towards the coast and the smaller towns. I spent some of this period working for the Together Lancashire, which was the Church Urban Fund company working in our part of the country. And a lot of my work was in these areas over here, Blackpool and Morecambe in particular, and around Preston, and became really struck by the way that these areas were now, as you can see from the dark red spots, some of the most deprived in the country. Fleetwood there as well. Other areas you see along the coast, the North Wales coast, Prestatyn Rhyl, Llandudno. On the east coast, that's Bridlington. I think that's Scarborough up there. And down there on the Lincolnshire coast, I know this very well because this is where I grew up. And places like Skegness and Boston, that's Chapel St Leonard's, where I used to go on holiday when I was a child, and Mablethorpe, show real indications of deep deprivation. And also many of these smaller areas, particularly here around the coalfield communities, also became major centres of deprivation. Not that the inner cities had solved everything. The red areas here in Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds and Bradford and Sheffield were clearly still significantly important. The last decade was the age of Brexit. The UK and the church divided. I don't think, and I've done some work and some of the analysis on the polling here and published about it, I don't think you can deny the influence of some elements of racism, nationalism, xenophobia in the narratives around Brexit. And there are various publications that I draw your attention to there, particularly Anthony Reddy's work. It was also a time of austerity. Public spending, particularly on welfare, declined. There was major welfare reform. And these, I know these are memes rather than detailed statistics, but the cuts had a great impact, particularly on families and particularly on local authority budgets and their services, and particularly impacting some of the urban local authorities and places like Blackpool as well. So an age of austerity, an age of Brexit, an age of division in many ways. It was also a time when the government policy was around the big society. The slogan is there, not big government. And there were many opportunities, and indeed churches and Christian groups did take up some of the welfare burden. I worked with the Church Urban Fund Together network, and among our colleagues and the groups that we partnered with and promoted on the Cinnamon Network and Acts 435 that encouraged direct giving to people in need. Yet the church also remained to be there as a critic of government policy. Books were written like The Myth of the Undeserving Poor, Housing Justice, lobbied and organized around housing and homelessness issues. The Poverty Truth networks, Poverty Truth commissions were a very significant and I think hopeful sign for giving voice to people in poor communities. Citizens UK grew. The refugee issues were important, and it's fascinating to see how the Jubilee Plus refugee network, very much an evangelical group, has got behind the whole issue of needs for, it's a coalition that's working on the needs of people who have no recourse to public funds, and the Movement for Justice and Reconciliation working on racial justice issues. We've got people from some of those groups or connected with some of those groups here tonight. And now into the 2020s, how will we respond? There's COVID and the recovery from that. There's Black Lives Matter. There's the climate crisis that we're already into the midst of. And most recently, the latest wave of refugees and asylum seeking issues around the Afghans. In fact, this week we've had half a dozen Afghan families arrived here in Preston, and they will be doing around the country in the weeks to come. So now to talk about what we have learned, the characteristics of urban ministry and mission. In the tract, I list something like 15, I think it is, issues that are important. The first one is about location. I said location, location, location. Place is so important. A strength of maybe the Church of England has been the commitment to parishes and to localities, and managed somehow to maintain a foothold even in most of the difficult urban areas and estates around the country. The pandemic has given some opportunities to serve, for Christians to serve in things like food partnership activities. There is in the background, there is a talk and a sort of almost a missiological movement called the New Parish Movement, which is, I think, quite significant. Congregations are important. The church cannot really exist without having congregations on the ground. Many of them are weak. Many places there is some investment in resource church networks, for example, and new expressions, fresh expressions emerging in various places. And there are also the diaspora communities. I don't want to talk in detail about them. Maybe Israel in his comments will have things to say there, but they have a slightly different dynamic and relationship to place. But it's significant that we can't really go on without having congregations established and sustained. Buildings are important. They can be a millstone around your neck, but they are so useful for running community and outreach activities, being a place of welcome for people from local communities. I'm in our parish at the moment. We are struggling to pull together a plan for the replacement of our barn of a Victorian church building that is not fit for purpose, with something that will be more user friendly and more easy to use for the community work and the outreach that we want to do. I'll tell you, I could tell you the story at length, but I won't tonight. The theme of making the word flesh and moving into the neighborhood, this sort of incarnational theology is so important. If place is important, having the right people and the right Christian activists, missionaries, whatever you want to call them, long-term available, close in the neighborhood is, I think, so important. And for those who I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but people who've grown up in the local communities and are Christian themselves, there's often a temptation to get up and go. Redemption and lift draws them away from their local communities. It's important to encourage, enable, and motivate people to stay as well as to move in. We have to reckon with the fact that urban ministry in most places is in a context of ethnic and religious diversity. And therefore, we need to be aware of different cultures, hopefully, where possible, to work for multicultural churches that are truly inclusive and offer a sense of equality of worth to people. And in many communities, and particularly this is so in the north of England, the religious diversity involves Muslim and other faith communities, Hindus, Sikhs, and the ethnic diversity now includes many people from Eastern Europe as well. It makes local communities a fascinating place to live, but sometimes quite difficult to navigate. And no one is going to be fully involved in all of the different cultures that can be around you. Networking, I think, is the key to urban ministry, the ability to cross between different sub-communities and groups, to build collaborative partnerships and to introduce people to each other. I've, in a sense, if I look back on my ministry over 40 years, this has been a key to my practice, it's been about connecting people up, getting them to talk to each other, seeing if there are ways they can work together for the common good. And I think it really is worthwhile, the church investing in people who can be free-floating, ecumenical and wider than ecumenical networkers, linking with the statutory and voluntary sector as well. Holistic mission, I hope and think that most urban missionaries take this for granted now. Body and soul cannot be separated. You can't speak the gospel effectively to someone who is hungry and has got holes in his shoes. I think it was General William Booth 150 years ago who first brought that to our attention. To a large extent, urban communities, and particularly working class communities, operate in an oral rather than a written culture. I was told back in 1975 that many of the people of West Ham, the only books they were likely to have in their household were the rent book and the catalogue, the shopping catalogue. And so often still, the church will have lots of words in its services, maybe less books now to give out. Now we have overhead projectors and digital projectors and so on. But we do tend to be, as Christians, very wordy. And it's essential to learn how to operate in a spoken culture. There are, of course, many cultures which we have to navigate, not only ethnic and different religious cultures, but cultures of different age groups, subgroups, and interest groups. Each have their own cultures or subcultures. We need to learn to do mission that is not to people or even for people, but with and alongside. Glad we've got Paul Keeble here tonight, because he's written a book on this and is called Mission With, and has majored on it. And there is a great joy to be had actually in doing mission alongside and with local communities. And it's often possible to find that that is the entry point. Volunteering in something like a food bank or a community anti-crime campaign can often be the place where people eventually find their way to wanting to think about, talk about, and eventually to follow Jesus. I throw up the idea of transformational yet struggling. I think Anna may have things to say on this, because that's been a theme of her work. But we would hope and believe that the gospel does actually transform people's lives and potentially can transform communities. And yet the reality is we live in the real world, and we find that we as individuals, we find that local churches, we find that local communities are struggling, and we can't be unrealistic about our expectations. We need to grapple with contextual theology, the liberation theologies, the Black theologies, the feminist theologies, and various forms of local theology. Not necessarily that turn us away from the great truths of the creeds and of the Bible, but ones which help us to understand these in the real life world in which we live and move and have our being. And likewise, there needs to be some way of developing urban spiritualities that are not retreat to a mountainside, although that can have its place, that are not just going to a corner of the church to pray, although that can have its place, or not just having our quiet time, but ways that connect with our prayers and our thoughts and our meditations with the city around us. We have to grapple finally with the fact that urban mission is inevitably political. It may be low-key, small scale, local politics, pavement politics, but we have to recognize that it is the political forces, political and economic forces, what Walter Wink calls powers and principalities, that often determine the life chances of people with whom we live and work. And finally, we need to take on the issue of equipping leaders. Even back in the Faith in the City report nearly 40 years ago, there was a big emphasis on how do you train and equip leaders for the church in these urban areas, particularly how do you train up, I think the phrase then was indigenous leaders. There are still issues going on. There were discussion then about Black and ethnic minority leaders and training and accepting them as clergy. Those issues have risen up again in the last year or two. Issues of women as leaders as well. Maybe we've made progress over 40 years on that in most of the churches, but it's still not totally resolved. And the question of how we equip the next generation of leaders for urban mission work is a crucial one. I hope I've left you now with a lot of questions. You can read a bit more of my thoughts in the tract itself, but I want to stop there and throw things further forward to, I'll stop my sharing, and I think it's the next person to speak will be Laurie Green. So can we, it's a bit difficult trying to chair this as well as talk. Chris has joined us. Hi Chris. Hello, would you like to take over the chairing now?
I will. Thank you so much. And apologies everyone for my technical hitches earlier this evening. My laptop just refused to do anything to connect to the internet, so I'm on my phone. welcome to this event, and thank you very much for joining it. My name is Chris Baker. I'm Director of Research at the William Temple Foundation, and I'm Professor of Religion, Belief and Public Life at Goldsmiths, University of London. And this is the kind of first in a series of autumn webinars where we're trying to continue to build on the work of the Temple tracts and create dialogues and spaces for encounter around the role of religion belief in the public sphere. The beauty of me not being at the beginning is you missed my 5-minute introduction, so there we are. At least we saved a bit of time. And it's my very great pleasure now to welcome one of the first of the respondents to Greg's excellent tracts, and I hope you've all had time to read it and download it. And I'm going to welcome Reverend Dr. Israel Olofinjana, who's the Evangelical Alliance's One People Commission Director and an ordained and accredited Baptist minister, leading 2 multi-ethnic Baptist churches and an independent charismatic church. And he's written extensively on partnership in mission, a Black majority church perspective on mission and church unity, and many other books. So Israel, I'm going to hand over to you, and thank you very much for being the first of our respondents.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much, Greg, for the presentation, which I found very useful and very helpful. And good evening, everyone. And good to be here this evening to be able to respond to Greg's sojourning and pilgrimage on this urban mission and public theology. I think one of the things that really strikes me from Greg's presentation was, was just the fact that in the 70s, 80s, there were a group of evangelicals that were engaging racial justice concern. I mean, something like the Evangelical Coalition for Urban Mission and the Evangelical Christians for Racial Justice. These are 2 groups that I really find fascinating. And the reason why I find them fascinating is that fast forwarding to where we are now with Black Lives Matter and COVID-19, the pandemic, raising questions around suffering and social justice, particularly with the impact of the pandemic on people of color, and the questions that has raised around race, identity, politics, nationalism, citizenship, and so on. I find it fascinating that somehow the idea of Black Lives Matter is still coming round again, despite the fact that we have evangelical Christians who were engaging this issue back in the 70s and 80s. And I think from my own research, there are other groups that were engaging this issue. There was the Zebra Project from the Methodist Church, Conference for Christian Partnership, Center for Black and White Partnership, Selyoke in Birmingham, who were engaging this issue around riots and racial reconciliation. And of course, the Evangelical Alliance, which I work for also, which I'm working for, also has West Indian Evangelical Alliance, which started in the 80s. But what I find interesting is the fact that Black Lives Matter has come round again. It's been around since the 40s with the Windrush, and it continues in different incarnations, raising the questions around otherness, around migration, whatever lens we choose to look at it, whether through Brexit or some of the migratory implications of that. That question has always been raised about Black lives in that sense. And I think with the evangelical engagement, it seems to me that those work were not really sustained. So that by the time we get into the 90s, what I observe from my own research is that you have folks within a different aspect of the church, people like Robert Beckford, developing Black theology, Anthony Reddy. And it seems that engagement around racial justice issues was confined or seen as a liberal agenda, so that by the time we get to the 2000s, evangelical seems to be not really engaging. And the death of George Floyd has really exposed our churches to this issue, because when the George Floyd thing happened, a lot of people were asking questions, a lot of church leaders, what do we do? How do I respond? This is not part of my training. What do we do? Where do we begin? And so it raises the question for me, why was it not sustained, that evangelical engagement? And why was it confined to the liberal aspect of the church? So that today, when we talk about Black theology, immediately it is labeled as a liberal agenda, a liberal approach, and evangelicals wouldn't really want to talk about it or engage that space. And so that is a question that I think we need to somehow answer and wrestle with tonight in that sense. But if I may start to offer some analysis on that, it seems to me that there is something about our theological engagement that does not really engage racial justice. And it seems to me that perhaps that problem of theological issue goes back to Enlightenment thinking. That, when we think about modern theology, is, trying to respond to the Enlightenment worldview and context, was sort of speaking into that space and trying to be intelligent in that space. But at the same time, it was also weak around the issue of racial justice. And we could see examples of that in terms of the colonization of various parts of the world and how evangelical Christians in those spaces, some spoke, some didn't. And of course, the whole narrative around Christianity, commerce, and civilization raises a whole lot of questions. And so what I'm simply saying is there seems to be a dichotomy between our theology and racial justice. There seems to be some form of weaknesses that today we talk about discipleship, and then racial justice is seen as either politics or wokeness or left-wing politics in that sense. So there is some disjunctment in that sense in our theologizing that has not really sustained that framework. And it seems to me that in this climate, we need a new theological framework to help us to begin to grapple with racial justice issues, especially from within the evangelical church, so that for those who see Black theology as a liberal agenda, might begin to look at scripture with a fresh hermeneutic lens that helps them to gaze and see that actually gospel is about justice, and definitely racial justice is at the heart of the gospel, because I don't know how you interpret the Ephesian moment that Andrew Ross talks about, the coming together of Jewish and Gentile communities. And I speak about, in closing, I'll speak about the Ephesian moment. It seems to me that just as God had to convince Peter, God had to convert Peter first into his intercultural purposes to be able to share the gospel with Cornelius. It seems to me that we have reached another key moment, a Cornelius moment, where it seems to be that there is the need to have that conversion again of the heart that can move us to begin to engage with the otherness, or however we describe people, and begin to engage from community and begin to speak into racial justice issues. It seems to me that we need that kind of a conversion, an intercultural conversion, so that we can engage in this space. I'll leave that and let other respond. Thank you.
Israel, very much for that response. I'm now going to invite our next respondent, Bishop Laurie Green, formerly Bishop of Bradwell and coordinator of the Estates Churches Network and author of numerous books on urban theology, many of which had a profound influence on my own theological and missional formation. And you can find his books at lauriegreen.org. So Bishop Laurie, you're very welcome to be with us, and we look forward to your 7 minutes of response. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Chris. I mean, this tract is really good. I'm really enjoying it. So what have we learned since 1981? That year began a total reformation of the United Kingdom. Within 5 years of that date, 1/3 of our industrial base was destroyed. The unions fell, the market reigned supreme. I was born in Newham, East Ham, it became Newham and then Newham, and saw our people turn from being essential producers to the society into irrelevant relics of a bygone economic system. And that's what we've got. Later, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, we lost the language of socialism with which the poor had always voiced their concerns in the past. And the church, unfortunately, bought into the marketplace mentality with its obsession about growth and market share, as you might say. Up till then, we urban practitioners had been working together as the Urban Mission Training Association. But in 1981, it split when the Evangelical Coalition, ECOM, separated off many evangelicals, they going their way and us liberals going ours. There weren't many of us left, actually. Now, I only got 7 minutes, Chris said, so I'll have to generalise a lot here. Sorry about that. Generally, the evangelicals followed many of the North American ideas of church, and we liberal Catholics went for South American liberation theology and political engagement that way. And despite some wonderful exceptions, we stayed separate, both sides suffering from not seeing the whole picture. I studied urban theology in America in the 60s, and we learnt there to ask of everything we do the power question. Who is actually benefiting here? The power question. So helping the poor may actually save the rich, salvation for them from having to change their exploitative policies, or regenerating London's clapped out docklands where I was living. Who really benefited? It's God's power question. Jesus shows us that our locality must be with the marginalised. Go live with the poor of Galilee, or the poor of urban Britain. But he also goes to Jerusalem to confront the powers, and the liberal wing, of which I'm a member, I guess, tried confronting the powers, working with New Labour, especially to bring in its social exclusion unit and Sure Start and new deals for the poor and all that sort of stuff. We went to the United Nations in the States as well on the back of a book I wrote then on urban global poverty, and we were promised more cash and support for poor urban settlements from them too. We even created an international urban mission network. But for all that, just as Israel has just said, again, it did not last. It was not sustained. Resources went to the church growth side, which so often means just maintenance masquerading as mission. Evangelicals were strengthening the congregations wonderfully, and our liberal mission worked hard nationally and globally. A valiant few managed to do both, and they stand out, and the tract spells out some of the names of those groups. But just think what we could have achieved if we'd worked more together. Now, it's not easy. I have to admit that I felt very much out of place attending the Jesus in the City congresses. They just spoke a different language from me. Liberal Catholics were doing well on interfaith engagement and spirituality, and especially we were running workshops on liberation praxis for parishes around the country. It's my great passion. So I did it from Handsworth, which was my home at that time, and I'm still doing it, although I'm running out of puff now as I get older. But at its heart, it's about listening to God in the Bible, listening to God in the community, and then letting those two revelations talk to one another. And I have to say, it's very dangerous stuff, and that's why a lot of people water it down. Have to listen honestly to that, not find excuses for it, which we normally do, but work out with them how that stuff got in there, which will help us understand it and fight it in today's society. Reflective theology leading to action. And the poor will also spot that they will inherit the kingdom, and it's woe to us who are rich. So we must allow them to claim their inheritance as the vanguard of the kingdom of God. Put them first. The church is scared to affirm the gifts of the poor. tends to use networks top down rather than bottom up. But people all the people who are with us tonight, we know that the marginalised are phenomenally gifted people. We can even learn the faith from them. They've got it in spades. But it's not in our language, their faith. It's not necessarily even in Christian language anymore. It's in the Holy Spirit's language, which I always reckon is body language. My first language was body language, wasn't even Cockney. And Paul says that that sort of language, spirit language, takes a lot of interpretation. So that's where our liberation theology comes in, if you like. Since 81, we've seen that there are now many, many different urban cultures. Again, Israel's been mentioned. One urban mission size does not fit all. And most of us are now hybrids. And I'm certainly not Cockney anymore. That was knocked out of me by every single teacher I ever went to, I think. The whole scene is now very, very complicated. And the urbanologists, which we must read, can help us understand that bigger picture. So we all need to work more closely together, because in my book, that more liberal book, if you like, we are fighting a battle against a political and theological culture which has alienated both the church and the nation from what the marginalised have to teach us all about the kingdom of God. It's a matter of listening to the poor, to the marginalised, for all of us. I think that's really where I'm up to on reading Greg's brilliant tract. I must thank my old mate Greg again for doing this. It's a thing we should all have been doing a long time ago. That's me done, Chris.
Thanks, Laurie. Thank you very much for covering all that ground and reminding us of the passion that you bring to this whole area of ministry. I'd like to now introduce our final respondent before we open up the floor to you, as it were. And I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Anna Ruddick, a community theologian and researcher who facilitates reflection and learning for leaders, congregations and Christian organisations seeking to deepen and strengthen their relationships with their communities. She is the author of Reimagining Mission from Urban Places, Missional Pastoral Care, which was published by SCM Press. And as Anna's also one of our trustees, just as Greg is also one of our research fellows. So Anna, it's lovely to have you with us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you everyone for your rich contributions so far. It's really, really good to be here this evening. And I wonder what else I can add in some ways. There is so much of what Israel and Laurie has shared that really resonates with me. And in reading Greg's work, I've been both, I guess, inspired by that kind of sense of this history. So much of the history feels like my history, having been involved in matters of urban mission for quite some years now. It feels like a very strange thing, actually, to begin to read a history that you're very familiar with in your own personal story. But I just wonder whether, I guess, where I'm kind of coming from and responding to what's been shared already is asking some questions about how we begin to conceive of urban mission and ministry now. We've kind of sketched the trajectory of how things have developed and asked them big questions about why things haven't moved on within a wider church perspective in our approaches to urban issues. And I wonder how we can begin to conceive of urban ministry now. And one of the challenges of that is the kind of sense of hybridity that Laurie was talking about, I think, and that now the vast majority of churches are engaging with issues of poverty in their areas. That's brilliant. It's a shift, particularly in evangelical terms, but it complicates things, because do we call that urban mission? Do we say anyone that is tackling issues of poverty in their areas, is that urban mission? And actually, I think in a lot of senses, a lot of urban practitioners and organisations seeking to resource urban mission have thought, yes, that is. So we get on board, we try and support these churches in their interventions. And there's merit in that. but I think the risks attached to it is that the vast majority of those churches tackling issues of poverty locally are not doing so with a kind of reflective willingness to be changed in their engagement, and which perhaps touches on what Israel and Laurie have raised already, that there is perhaps not an expectation that that we as Christians will be changed in the course of our engagement with people who are different to us, and that is to be expected, that is in fact the mission of God to us, just as it might be part of the mission of God in our communities as well. So I think the complexity of the context is really interesting, and the hybridity of our context is really interesting, and how we then begin to engage with that wider picture of every church involved in a food bank. So, okay, so is urban mission and ministry a food bank? Well, we'll really know. And actually, so much of what Greg has outlined as part of the key characteristics of urban mission are kind of diametrically opposed to the ethos of food banks. It is not, in most cases, it is not mission with, it is very much to or for. And so there's real challenges involved in that, I think, that experienced urban mission practitioners have to bring to that widespread picture of every church involved in a food bank, or addressing poverty issues in some way, shape or form in their area. I think Greg touched a little bit on this idea of urban mission being transformative but struggling, and I guess he mentioned that I've kind of done some thinking about this, and I guess just to perhaps elaborate a little, is that a lot of what I've seen is that the struggle is part of the gift, that perhaps our theological expectations for mission and ministry are from one degree of glory to another, and that may be, as Israel pointed out, particularly in evangelical world, perhaps a bit more of a feature of modernist enlightenment thinking of kind of exponential growth than it is a kind of gospel idea, and there is gift for us in recognizing the value of the seed that falls to the ground and dies, that actually there is a kind of sense in which urban mission and ministry, when it is transformative, that transformation is both flourishing in people's lives, and it is also loss and ambiguity as things are broken apart and new things are able to emerge. There is both of those threads going on, and they are both the gift that can emerge when we really engage people in relationships that change both parties within that relationship. And I guess I've been doing quite a bit of thinking about particularly the context of evangelicalism, what slows us down or holds us back from those kind of transformative relationships. And I think it is that kind of bizarre and complicated, messy mixture of theology and culture that we are entrenched within, that is sticky, that is very difficult to unpick. It becomes a kind of sense of the way that we do things is God ordained, and some of what Laurie was saying is that there needs to be a kind of critical engagement with that, and certainly Black Lives Matter is a brilliant critical engagement with that. It calls us to ask ourselves, is actually the way we do things God ordained? Actually, probably not. There is this kind of messy mix, and I guess my approach to the evangelical church in the UK at the moment would be to ask us to think differently, to ask us to face some hard questions, and to call ourselves to a different way of being, call ourselves to a different way of engaging with God and with people, particularly people who are different to us. And I guess there are three things that briefly I was thinking about as I was thinking of responding to this. Firstly, I think evangelicalism needs to not build its identity on its certainty. So much of evangelical identity is rested on its being certain about lots of things. but actually God is bigger than that. And really, if we're really pinned down, we know this, like we know that God is bigger than our ideas, than our language that we use to frame our theologies. And we trust that in the midst of it, we find truth, but God is bigger than all of that. And for evangelicalism, I think it really needs to let go of some of that clinging on to certainty as part of its identity in order to receive the gift that people who are different can bring, and the revelation of God that people can bring. Secondly, I think evangelicalism really needs to let go of shaping discipleship as an exercise in opposition to the world. By setting ourselves up in this kind of oppositional relationship, that we are trying to be more like Christ in opposition to the world around us that is opposed to the gospel, I think that just causes us problems, actually. It creates and perpetuates an us and them, which is deeply unhelpful when we're then looking to come alongside people in communities. And there's a real need, I think, to overcome some of that and to articulate discipleship in a different way, simply to see ourselves gravitating towards Jesus and alongside Jesus, along with others in our communities. And thirdly and finally, I think there is a call to the evangelical church not to hide its energy and its charisma inside its church buildings and its meeting structures. Laurie mentioned the work of the Holy Spirit, and one of the great gifts within charismatic evangelicalism is the expectation that we engage with God in daily life, that we expect to encounter God as we go about our routines in the world. And that, I think, is a real window for evangelicalism to begin to encounter a kind of urban spirituality which hears God, receives from God, finds God and discovers God in the lives and voices and agency of people who are different. And yet so much of evangelical energy is kept within church buildings, church meetings, a kind of set model of how charisma is expressed within our church cultures. And I think there's a real invitation actually to go beyond that and to see a kind of spirituality and a charismatic engagement with our communities, with our streets, and with the people and neighbours that we live amongst and seek to get to know and receive from, as well as offer to. So there, I guess, my three things that I was mulling over: not building an evangelical identity on certainty because God is bigger, not shaping discipleship as an exercise of opposition to the world, and because actually God is deeply imbued in our world, in whom we live and move and have our being, and not hiding our energy and our charisma within our buildings, but finding that within daily life.